The massive bomber was on fire, with bright flames spreading along the starboard wing as thick black smoke began to fill the cramped cockpit. Below them lay nothing but the black void of hostile territory, offering a terrifying choice to the young men trapped inside. Most crews in that exact situation would not hesitate, choosing to jump and disappear into the darkness to hope for a chance at survival. But this pilot refused to let go of the control column. He stared through the shattered glass into the freezing night, making a decision that defied every basic human instinct. This is the story of a man who looked at the impossible odds and chose to keep flying. The journey had started as just another routine operation, one of the countless missions flown in the dark skies over occupied Europe. Bomber crews relied on strict discipline and absolute trust in their machines to survive the grueling flights across the English Channel. They expected heavy resistance, but they never expected their own aircraft to become a fiery trap. Somewhere deep over enemy territory, the four-engine bomber took a devastating hit. Whether it was a precise burst of heavy anti-aircraft fire or a lethal strike from a prowling night fighter, the men inside had no time to figure it out. The impact was immediate, tearing through the metal skin and shattering the fragile piece of the flight. One of the engines erupted into a raging inferno, illuminating the pitch-black sky with a terrifying orange glow. The aircraft shook with violent force, throwing the exhausted crew against their stations as the noise of the explosion deafened their ears. Within a matter of seconds, the calm environment inside the cockpit changed into absolute chaos. Acrid smoke started to fill the air, growing thick and suffocating as it poured through the fuselage. The primitive flight instruments flickered and died, leaving the pilot blind to his altitude and heading in the middle of a war zone. The heavy mechanical controls became stiffer with every passing moment, fighting against the hands trying to save the machine. The teenage gunners and the young navigator looked toward their captain, realizing what the failing systems meant. The structural integrity of the wing was melting away under the extreme heat, and the fuel lines threatened to ignite a massive explosion. They were losing the aircraft, and time was running out. In that heart-stopping moment, the choice presented to the crew was brutally simple and binary. They could clip on their parachutes, abandon the dying bomber, and jump into the freezing unknown to become prisoners of war. It was the logical choice, the safe choice, the choice that guaranteed they would wake up the next morning. The alternative was a gamble that bordered on pure madness. They could stay in their freezing seats, trust their captain, and try to fly a burning bomber all the way back to the safety of the English coast. The margin for error was non-existent, and a single mistake meant falling into the abyss as a ball of fire. The pilot gripped the heavy yoke, feeling the brutal vibrations of the dying engine tearing at the frame. Instead of giving the order to bail out, instead of turning away from what seemed like an inevitable disaster, he locked his eyes on the horizon. He made his decision in the silence of his own mind. He kept flying. Through the raging fire, through the blinding smoke, and through the mechanical systems that were failing all around him, he held the massive aircraft in the air. The true test of human endurance had just begun. The raging fire consumed the starboard wing, turning the aluminum skin into glowing ash as the wind fed the inferno. The heat radiated through the thin metal of the fuselage, battling the freezing air that rushed in through the shattered glass. The massive bomber was dying in the dark, and every man on board could feel the machine tearing itself apart. The pilot gripped the control column with white knuckles, fighting the intense aerodynamic drag caused by the burning engine. The heavy yoke pulled hard to the right, demanding absolute physical strength just to keep the nose level with the horizon. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but he refused to let the aircraft slip into a fatal dive. Behind him, in the cramped cabin, The teenage crew members waited in absolute silence for the inevitable command to jump. They gripped their parachute harnesses, staring at the red glow outside their tiny windows while their hearts hammered in their chests. But the intercom remained silent, and they soon realized their captain was not giving up. The young flight engineer scrambled across the vibrating floorboards to cut the main fuel lines to the burning motor. He knew the massive aviation gas tanks were located just feet away from the open flames, making the entire bomber a flying bomb. He worked with frantic energy to starve the fire before it could reach the explosive reserves. At his small wooden desk, the navigator wiped sweat and soot from his eyes to calculate their desperate heading. He traced a line on his paper chart toward the English coast, knowing the distance was massive and their speed was dropping fast. They were a crippled target crawling across a hostile sky, and the odds of survival were almost zero. Every single minute in the air felt longer than the last as the crew watched the fire continue to spread. The flames licked at the structural ribs of the wing, threatening to snap the entire spar and send them plummeting into the abyss. The groaning sound of bending metal echoed through the cabin over the roar of the surviving engines. They were no longer hidden in the pitch-black void of the night offensive, because the fire turned them into a brilliant beacon. German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground could see the burning silhouette miles away, tracking their slow progress with ease. The crew expected a barrage of lethal flak to erupt at any moment. Yet the pilot ignored the glowing target painted on his back and focused his mind on the geometry of the flight. He pushed the remaining throttles forward, demanding everything the surviving Merlin engines could give to keep them airborne. He blocked out the pain in his arms and the suffocating smoke filling his lungs. The men in the back of the plane understood the terrifying gamble their captain had taken for them. Bailing out over enemy territory meant facing the brutal reality of prison camps, assuming they even survived the jump in the dark. Staying with the ship meant they lived or died together as a crew. They passed the invisible point of no return, leaving the option to abandon the aircraft far behind them in the night. The margin for error disappeared with every passing second, leaving them with nothing but raw hope and the skill of the man at the controls. The burning bomber pressed onward toward the English Channel. There was no certainty they would make it across the dark water, but giving up was never part of the plan. The pilot kept his eyes locked on the invisible horizon, holding the broken machine in the sky through sheer willpower alone. They were going to fly until the wings ripped off or the wheels touched the ground. The burning bomber crossed the hostile coastline and entered the airspace over the freezing ocean. The immediate threat of German anti-aircraft fire faded into the dark, but the battle for survival entered a new and terrifying phase. The massive stretch of black water below them offered no safety and no place to land if the shattered wing broke under the strain. The raging inferno on the starboard side began to shrink as the intense wind starved the flames. The fire had consumed the paint and the aluminum skin, leaving behind a twisted skeleton of scorched metal. The crew watched the terrifying glow fade away, replacing the immediate threat of a massive explosion with the creeping dread of structural failure. The relief inside the cramped cabin lasted for a fraction of a second before a new nightmare emerged. The flight engineer shined his flashlight onto the cracked instrument panel and noticed the fuel gauges dropping fast. The ruptured lines had bled hundreds of gallons of precious aviation gas into the night sky. The steady roar of the surviving engines began to change pitch as the fuel starvation took hold. The deep rumble turned into a desperate cough, vibrating through the floorboards and shaking the exhausted men to their core. The massive machine was losing its lifeblood, and the English coast was still miles away. The pilot fought the heavy control yoke with numb hands and aching shoulders. Flying the damaged aircraft on uneven power required massive physical effort just to keep the nose pointed toward home. He ignored the burning pain in his arms and focused his entire mind on the dark horizon. The heavy bomber began to lose altitude, sinking closer to the unforgiving waves with every passing mile. The captain barked an order over the intercom, commanding his men to strip the aircraft of all excess weight. The teenage gunners and the navigator ripped their stations apart to lighten the massive load. Heavy ammunition belts and heavy steel machine guns went out the escape hatches and plummeted into the sea. The crew tossed their parachutes and their emergency gear into the freezing wind, knowing those items were useless if the plane hit the water. They sacrificed their only means of escape to buy the pilot a few more minutes of flight. Throwing the parachutes into the dark ocean cemented the bond between the machine and the men inside. They were absolute prisoners of the shattered bomber, committed to the brutal choice their captain made over enemy territory. There was no turning back, and no alternative to the agonizing crawl across the sea. Another engine sputtered and died with a loud metallic clank, leaving the propeller to spin useless in the wind. The loss of thrust pulled the heavy nose down even further, forcing the pilot to pull back on the yoke with everything he had. The margin for error vanished for good as the altimeter needles scraped the bottom of the dial. The freezing waves of the North Sea were now visible through the shattered perspex of the cockpit. Ditching a crippled heavy bomber in the dark water was a guaranteed death sentence for the exhausted crew. The massive aircraft would break apart on impact and sink like a stone before anyone could escape the wreckage. The pilot refused to let the ocean claim his men after they had survived the inferno of the flak zones. He coaxed every last drop of power from the remaining engines, staring into the dark mist for any sign of land. The ultimate test of human endurance was reaching its absolute peak. The black horizon began to crack as a thin gray line of morning light broke through the freezing mist. The exhausted men stared through the shattered glass of the cockpit with hollow eyes and aching bodies. The unmistakable shape of the English coastline emerged from the dark water like a concrete miracle. The crippled bomber was flying just a few hundred feet above the crushing waves of the ocean. The shattered starboard wing groaned under the immense pressure of holding the massive fuselage in the air. The pilot fought the heavy control column with every ounce of his remaining strength. A coastal emergency airstrip appeared ahead as a flat strip of tarmac surrounded by wet grass. The crew felt a massive surge of adrenaline replacing the numb exhaustion in their veins. But the battle to bring the burning machine back to the earth was far from over. The captain barked an order to lower the heavy undercarriage and prepare for a rough landing. The flight engineer pushed the hydraulic lever forward and waited for the familiar mechanical clank of the wheels locking into place. The warning lights on the dashboard remained dark and silent. The raging fire over enemy territory had melted the primary fluid lines in the starboard wing. The aircraft possessed zero hydraulic pressure to push the massive rubber tires out of the metal bays. The pilot was forced to face a crash landing in a bomber loaded with aviation gas fumes. The young flight engineer refused to let a mechanical failure doom his crew on the edge of salvation. He abandoned his seat and crawled toward the manual hand pump located on the vibrating floorboards. He grabbed the cold steel handle and began to pump with frantic energy. Lowering the massive metal landing gear by hand required brutal physical effort and precious time. The engineer pumped the lever up and down while his chest heaved for oxygen in the freezing air. The muscles in his arms burned as the heavy wheels fought against the intense aerodynamic drag. The concrete runway rushed toward the shattered nose of the bomber at terrifying speed. The pilot pulled the throttles back to reduce the thrust of the surviving engines and coax the aircraft downward. He needed to touch the ground as soft as possible to prevent the weakened wing from snapping. A loud mechanical thud echoed through the empty cabin as the left wheel locked into position. The engineer kept pumping with absolute desperation to force the right side down before the concrete arrived. The right wheel dropped into the airstream and locked just seconds before impact. The captain fought the crosswind, pulling at the massive tail fins and the damaged control surfaces. He cut the ignition to the remaining engines to eliminate the risk of sparks igniting the fuel vapor. The heavy bomber became a massive metal glider, plunging toward the damp runway. The men braced for the brutal shock of hitting the solid earth after hours of absolute terror. The pilot held the control yoke tight against his chest and prayed the ruined wing would hold its shape. The massive rubber tires slammed into the concrete with a deafening screech. The heavy bomber slammed into the concrete runway with a deafening screech of burning rubber. The brutal shock wave traveled through the shattered aluminum frame and rattled the teeth of every exhausted man on board. The pilot fought the heavy control yoke to keep the nose pointed straight ahead as the momentum pushed them forward. The ruined starboard wing groaned under the extreme stress of the sudden impact. The scorched metal structure bent downward toward the damp tarmac as the massive machine rolled at terrifying speed. The captain stomped on the rudder pedals to counteract the massive drag pulling them toward the dirt. Sparks erupted from the undercarriage as the pilot applied maximum pressure to the mechanical brakes. The brake pads screamed against the steel drums while a thick cloud of white smoke swallowed the tail section. The men in the back braced for a catastrophic failure because the damaged wing threatened to snap off at any moment. The crippled bomber swerved off the center line and skidded toward the wet grass on the edge of the strip. The landing gear dug deep into the soft earth and sent massive clumps of mud flying into the air. The violent vibration tossed the teenage gunners against the metal walls of the fuselage. With a final agonizing lurch of tearing metal and crushed earth, the four-engine beast ground to a complete halt. The deafening roar of the flight was replaced by the terrifying hiss of leaking aviation gas and hot steel. The desperate journey across the dark sky was over, but the danger of a ground explosion was absolute and real. The captain did not wait for the dust to settle before giving his final order of the mission. He ripped his leather helmet off and yelled for his men to abandon the shattered aircraft. The crew scrambled through the cramped cabin with frantic energy to reach the main escape hatches. The young aviators kicked the jammed metal doors open and tumbled out into the cold morning air. They hit the wet ground hard and scrambled away from the leaking fuel tanks as fast as their numb legs could move. The stench of scorched wire and raw gasoline filled their lungs. The pilot was the last man to leave the ruined cockpit of the heavy bomber. He climbed through the top hatch and slid down the smooth side of the nose section to join his exhausted crew. He hit the damp grass and ran toward the safety of the perimeter fence without looking back. Bright red fire engines and military ambulances raced across the airfield with their sirens wailing in the dawn mist. Ground crews in heavy asbestos suits unrolled massive canvas hoses to spray foam over the smoking engines. The emergency teams worked with desperate speed to prevent the crippled machine from turning into a massive fireball. The surviving aviators collapsed onto the wet grass a safe distance away from the smoking wreckage. They sat in absolute silence and watched the rescue crews drown their shattered bomber in thick white foam. The true scale of their survival hit them as they stared at the charred skeleton of the starboard wing. The men realized the massive aluminum structure was melted and bent beyond repair. It was a mechanical miracle that the wing stayed attached to the fuselage during the long flight across the ocean. The pilot had carried them home through the fire and the dark with nothing but raw willpower and unyielding courage. The immediate danger passed. The crash sirens faded, and the physical toll of the flight crashed down on the exhausted crew. The men sat on the damp grass, shivering in the cold morning wind as the massive surge of adrenaline left their blood. Military medics arrived with thick wool blankets and hot mugs of tea for the freezing aviators. The young gunners wrapped the heavy fabric around their shaking shoulders, staring at the smoking remains of their machine in absolute silence. A transport truck pulled up to the perimeter fence to drive the survivors to the main intelligence buildings. The crew climbed into the back of the vehicle with stiff joints and bruised limbs, leaving the ruined bomber behind on the grass. Inside the warm wooden huts, the bright electric lights felt harsh against their strained eyes. The men sat at a long table covered in maps and official forms, waiting for the interrogation officers to record the brutal events of the night. A senior intelligence officer walked into the room with a notepad, expecting a standard report of anti-aircraft fire and cloud cover. He took one look at the soot and dried sweat on their faces and knew this mission was different from the rest. The pilot began to speak, his voice hoarse from shouting over the roar of the engines and the wind. He described the massive impact over enemy territory, the raging fire on the starboard wing, and the terrifying loss of mechanical control. He confessed that standard protocol demanded a fast exit when the fire threatened the main fuel tanks, but he explained his refusal to abandon the aircraft, choosing to risk a massive explosion in the sky rather than surrender his men to the enemy. The officer stopped writing on his notepad, stunned by the sheer scale of the danger they had survived. He understood that staying inside a burning heavy bomber went against every survival manual printed by the armed forces. The young flight engineer spoke up from across the table, defending the impossible choice made by their captain. He told the officer about the melted wing and the agonizing crawl across the dark ocean, praising the sheer willpower of the man sitting beside him. The intelligence officers realized the pilot had executed a miracle of human endurance and raw nerve. The decision to keep the burning machine airborne was a massive gamble, but it was the sole reason these men were sitting in the warm room today. The official interrogation ended with a profound sense of respect for the exhausted aviators. The crew received orders to rest, carrying the invisible weight of a night that pushed them to the absolute limit of human courage. The mechanics walked out to the edge of the airfield to inspect the smoking bomber in the morning light. They stared at the charred starboard wing in absolute disbelief. The intense fire had melted the internal structure and fused the aluminum plates together. The ground crew realized the massive aircraft should have broken apart miles away from the English coast. The physical laws of aerodynamics dictated that the crippled machine could not sustain flight. But the man in the cockpit refused to accept the math. The engineering officer touched the scorched metal and felt the heat still radiating from the frame. He looked at the shattered cockpit and understood the massive physical toll the flight took on the pilot. Holding that heavy machine in the air required strength that defied logic. The surviving crew members stood near the perimeter fence and watched the inspection in silence. They saw the faces of the mechanics pale as they traced the path of the fire near the main fuel lines. The young men understood how close they came to a massive explosion. There was no celebration on the damp grass that morning. The grim reality of the night offensive left no room for cheering because every man knew they had to fly again. They survived the impossible, but the war in the dark was far from over. In the darkness of war, survival did not always depend on luck or advanced engineering. Sometimes the difference between life and death came down to a single choice, made in a moment of extreme terror. The pilot possessed the chance to give up and chose to fight the raging fire instead. We sit in the safety of the modern world and analyze combat decisions made under heavy enemy fire. We read the official mission reports and study the black and white photographs of shattered airplanes. But we can never replicate the suffocating fear of a burning cockpit in the dead of the night. The young men of Bomber Command fought their brutal campaign in a pitch-black, freezing void. They operated massive aluminum machines over hostile territory with zero margin for error. Every single mission demanded immense courage and an unbreakable trust between the captain and his crew. Thousands of teenage aviators never made it back from those long night missions. They vanished into the freezing clouds and left nothing but empty bunks in the morning. We honor their staggering sacrifice by remembering the impossible choices they faced in the dark. So look back at this incredible act of defiance and think about the sheer nerve of that young commander. What would you do if the right wing of your aircraft turned into a raging inferno? Would you trust your pilot to cross the ocean, or would you take your chances with a parachute in the dark? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and tell me how you would handle that impossible situation. Hit that subscribe button to join our relentless pursuit of military history. I will see you in the next dark chapter of human conflict.